Welcome. Today we have with us Tarah to talk about violence and particularly ethics of violence in the Hebrew Bible. So the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament tends to get a bit of a bad rap when it comes to violence because people think it contains a lot of violence. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think when we're looking at the Hebrew Bible, in order to kind of have a fair conversation about violence, there's really two questions we have to ask ourselves before we sort of jump into that conversation. The first one is, for what purpose is the author of the text using the violence? In other words, does the author actually agree with the violence going on? And the reason I bring that up is because a good analogy for this kind of, for lacking this kind of approach is if we were looking at let's say we're looking at an expose on television that was produced, by a very reputable news source, and it was covering the story of the brutal rape and murder of a woman. Now, most people I know would not watch that newsreel and think that the person delivering that story agreed with that act that happened, because we would already assume we knew the context in which we're seeing this sort of expose happen. Now, something kind of similar we can play out with the Hebrew Bible, where when we're reading a book and we see very violent acts happen, we should be sort of contextualizing ourselves in the same way. An example I can give you is the book of Judges. The book of Judges is full of some of the most controversial scenes. They would rival any headline today. However, when you read the book of Judges in order, and those sort of violent scenes in sequence, what we see is the author, the person putting these scenes together, is demonstrating the moral deterioration of Israel while they're being ruled under judges. So the point is, the author knows how terrible these violent acts are in this book and is using them to demonstrate the moral depravity of a society. This, of course, does not apply to everything in the Hebrew Bible, but it's important to ask yourself that just to make sure that when you're reading that text, you're on the same page with the author, so to speak. The second thing that I encourage people to ask themselves is, have I seen this violent act in the news today? And I say that because doing that helps us to dispel the illusion that we like to carry with ourselves of how much more peaceful our society is than the one that we see depicted in the Hebrew Bible. Violence is a part of the human condition. So it is therefore a part of every conversation that we have in the Hebrew Bible is part of that conversation as well. So after all of that, then we can kind of take a fair assessment of the violence that we see happening in the Hebrew Bible.
Thanks. So violence covers a lot of territory.
Yes, it does.
Can we break that down in any kind of helpful way?
Yes, we absolutely can, and we should. Generally, in just our modern context, we do not talk about violence as an abstract sort of phenomenon for any length of time. We have to start seeing violence in context, because that is when we actually make sort of judgments about the violent act that's occurring. So in the Hebrew Bible, it's no different. We have violence that occurs within the context of warfare. Well, warfare violence is a completely different conversation, set of vocabulary, than violence that occurs between, say, a husband and wife. So by breaking those acts of violence down into those basic categories that even we use when we are trying to have conversations about violence, all of a sudden we get down to the essence of what's happening in that text, and we use a vocabulary that's appropriate to that text. We would never, I don't think, use the same vocabulary that we do for a battle, for instance, as we do for a text that's recounting a form of domestic violence. Those are two different scenarios, and they deserve two different vocabularies.
So I think often what bothers people about the violence in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament has to do with ethics. Is this morally justifiable? So if I could ask you, maybe, could we come at this almost from a historical point of view first? How do the writers of these texts understand or sometimes justify or indeed maybe not justify the violent actions which we see in these texts.
Right. The writers do something that's both extremely different because of their kind of historical context and somewhat the same as what we do. And that is they have a hierarchy, if you will, of moral culpability for violent acts as well. So, for instance, in the same way that we look at a person who has killed someone in self-defense, as opposed to a person who has premeditated someone's murder, both are very violent acts. Both end in a person who has died, but we see two different moral stories that are happening in those events. In the ancient Near East, it isn't actually as different as we assume. It's a similar kind of conversation. The thing that differs is the hierarchy itself. So the violent acts that we find or we call morally depraved, for instance, things that seem to go well beyond anything that we would accept, are not the same now as they were in the ancient Near East in the context that the Hebrew Bible is written. Something I can come up with instantly is violent acts that happen within the context of war. In ancient Near Eastern warfare, extremely violent acts happen, and they have a lot to do with, first, the ideology that's happening in the sort of formation of a nation and how they understand themselves. There's conversations happening in warfare that have to do with purity of a group of people and making sure that their land, their identity, their entire vision of what they're supposed to be isn't tainted. So what happens is, at least in the Assyrian culture, we could say, you have people being beheaded who are leaders of armies to deter the rest of the army from how do I say this, from going any further and increasing any more deaths. So I guess what I mean by all of this is when we look at violence and we try to weigh the moral culpability of an act, not only do we have to acknowledge that there is a hierarchy of sort of violent acts that the ancient Near East sort of abides by, the Hebrew Bible abides by, we have our own. And by sort of recognizing that they're not necessarily parallel, but that we have them, that we do look at someone who's a soldier in war differently than we look at someone who is hunting a woman through a park. That helps us to start questioning maybe the moral culpability conversation that we're having isn't so clear as I once imagined.
So how might then understanding the historical context and the historical hierarchies and historical logic of some of these violent acts help us in interpreting them today?
Well, it should be a consolation to readers of the Hebrew Bible today that premeditated murder is still right up there with a considered a totally heinous act within a community. Even in the ancient Near East, a premeditated murder of someone within your town, within your community, was just an unforgivable act, and it deserved death itself. We see premeditated murder still today this way. It still is at the top of our sort of scale of depravity as far as violent acts go that are unacceptable. Watching how that scale diminishes to more and more acceptable forms of violence is what is most telling in the division between us and an ancient Near Eastern culture, and kind of also even a critique on our own. So as we move through that hierarchy in ancient Near Eastern culture, we get into these realms of speech acts that are so, lying, for instance, is considered so morally depraved that it deserves death in many cases. We would find this, well, it would eliminate several people on the political platform that we would never, see again. This doesn't exist in our world today. But in the ancient Near East, it was extremely important. So we, watching that hierarchy as it diminishes from this sort of one thing that we all kind of agree on with premeditated murder, that's when things get fuzzy and we kind of just have to
start thinking about our own priorities,
Yeah,
really.
I guess so.
Great. Thank you very much.